Jackson, Mississippi. A quiet suburban morning. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden hue through the curtains of the Jenkins home. Inside, the air was thick with the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. It was a scene of peace, of normalcy, of a life built on decades of unwavering routine. Vivian Jenkins, 68, stood at the stove, humming softly as she flipped pancakes onto a plate. She loved mornings like this, the quiet comfort of familiarity. A gospel tune played faintly from the old radio on the windowsill, its melody blending with the rhythmic crackling of the pan. At the kitchen table, her husband, Lawrence Larry Jenkins, sat with his usual routine, the morning newspaper folded neatly in his hands, a steaming cup of black coffee at his side. He was a man of discipline, a former deacon, well respected in their community, a man with a calm, unshaken presence, a man with secrets. Vivian glanced at him as she set the plates down. 3 pancakes, just like always, she said with a soft smile. Larry smirked, adjusting his reading glasses. You know me too well, Viv. She chuckled, taking a seat across from him. The smell of home, the warmth of their shared silence. It felt like any other morning. Then came the knock. It was sharp, firm, heavy. Not a friendly knock, not a neighbor stopping by, not a package delivery. Vivian frowned, dabbing her hands on a dish towel as she rose from her seat. Something in her chest tightened, a feeling, a warning. She moved toward the door, hesitating only briefly before unlocking it and pulling it open. Her breath caught. FBI. A team of federal agents stood at her doorstep, their stance rigid, their expressions unreadable. Their presence filled the space like a storm rolling in. This wasn't local police. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was serious. Her voice wavered as she gripped the edge of the door. Can I help you?" The lead agent, a tall man in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a steel-cut demeanor, took a step forward. His badge gleamed in the morning light. His voice was cold, deliberate. "Ma'am, is your husband home?" Vivian's stomach dropped. She turned, glancing back at Larry, who had just stood from the table. The newspaper slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft thud on the kitchen floor. His face had changed. The calm was gone. She saw it, the sudden tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders locked. Recognition. Larry wasn't confused. He was caught. Vivian looked back at the agents, swallowing hard. Yes, he's right here. What is this about? The lead agent didn't shift, didn't blink. "Lawrence Jenkins, you are under arrest for the murder of your son, Ezekiel Jenkins." The room tilted. Vivian's world stopped. For a moment, silence. Her ears rang, her hands trembled, her mind struggled to comprehend the words. Ezekiel, their only son, missing for 33 years. She turned back to Larry, waiting for him to laugh, to shake his head, to demand to know what they were talking about. But he didn't. Larry didn't move. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply lowered his head. The lead agent motioned to the others, and in seconds, Larry's hands were behind his back, cuffs locking around his wrists. Vivian's throat tightened. What are you talking about?" Larry exhaled slowly, avoiding her gaze. He said nothing. One of the agents began reading his rights, but the words barely registered. Vivian's vision blurred, her pulse pounded. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Not Larry. Not her husband. He was the man who had led the search for Ezekiel, who had held her hand during the vigils, who had stood at the church altar, voice breaking as he prayed for their son to come home. But now she saw something she had never seen before. A shift in his face, a mask unraveling. Her knees weakened. She had spent 47 years beside a man she didn't even know. This is the story of a mother's love, a father's darkest secret, and a truth buried for decades, until one clue shattered everything. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling events that led the FBI straight to the Jenkins home. Subscribe now for more true crime stories that will make you question everything. Jackson, Mississippi, 1980s. A place where reputation meant everything. Where a man's worth was measured by his standing in the church, his discipline at home, and the strength of his convictions. In the Jenkins household, everything looked perfect. Larry Jenkins was a pillar of the community, a deacon at Grace Baptist Church, a man whose booming voice carried through the congregation every Sunday as he led prayers and spoke of righteousness, of discipline, of what it meant to be a God-fearing man. He dressed the part, tailored suits, polished shoes, and the Bible always in hand. People trusted him, respected him. They saw a devoted husband, a hard-working father, a man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. Vivian was the heart of the home, warm, nurturing, the kind of woman who never missed a Sunday service, who made sure every guest had a plate full of food. She raised 3 children with unwavering love. Her daughters Lorraine and Jasmine, and their only son, Ezekiel. For years, from the outside looking in, the Jenkins family was picture perfect. But behind closed doors, things were different. The son who never fit in. From the moment Ezekiel could walk, he was different. Where other boys in the neighborhood played football in the streets, Ezekiel sat under the old oak tree in their backyard, sketching. His hands, delicate and precise, moved across the pages of his worn-out sketchbook like an artist lost in his world. He loved colors, details, the beauty in things most people overlooked. He had a mind that stretched far beyond Jackson, beyond church pews and backyard barbecues. But to Larry, it wasn't right. A boy needs to be tough, he would say, shaking his head when Ezekiel turned down his invitation to throw a football in the yard. Vivian saw the look in her son's eyes, the sadness, the confusion, but she also saw the look in Larry's, disapproval, disgust, a quiet, growing resentment. It started small, little jabs at dinner. "You need to toughen up, boy." Snatched up sketchbooks. "You wasting time on this nonsense." A disappointed shake of the head whenever Ezekiel walked into the room. Larry never hit his son. He didn't need to. His words were sharp enough. Vivian did her best to soften the blows. She'd sneak into Ezekiel's room at night, stroke his hair, while he pretended to be asleep. She saw the way he shrank himself, tried to make himself smaller, quieter, invisible. She prayed over him, prayed that Larry would ease up, prayed that Ezekiel would stop being so different. But the gap between father and son only widened. Larry carried himself like a man of unwavering principles. At church, he was gentle and full of wisdom. He spoke about God's love, about patience, about forgiveness. At home, he ruled with an iron fist. His daughters knew not to test him. Vivian knew when to stay quiet. But Ezekiel was born with a quiet defiance. He wouldn't pretend to be something he wasn't, and Larry hated him for it. The whispers started when Ezekiel turned 14. People in town noticed he wasn't like the other boys. He moved differently, spoke softly. His laughter was lighter, freer. "Boy's got a little too much sugar in his step," one of the older men at church had said, chuckling to Larry after service one Sunday. Larry didn't laugh. That night, Vivian heard the argument. Larry's voice, low and sharp. "You see how people looking at him, Viv? You hear what they saying?" "He's our son, Larry," she had pleaded, holding onto his arm. He's a good boy. Larry had pulled away. I ain't about to have no gay boy living under my roof. Vivian's heart stopped. She looked at him then, really looked at him. This man, her husband, the father of her children, the deacon of their church, he meant it. She knew Larry had a temper, but something about the way he said those words made her uncomfortable. She never told Ezekiel what she heard that night, but maybe somehow he already knew. As the months passed, Ezekiel withdrew. He stopped sketching outside, stopped talking as much. He stopped being himself. Larry saw it as a win. Finally, the boy learning. But Vivian saw what was really happening. Her son was shrinking. She tried to comfort him in small ways, extra pancakes on his plate, slipping him a few dollars when he went out with friends. But nothing could fix what was already broken. Ezekiel was fighting a war inside a house where he was supposed to be safe, and he was losing. Vivian thought about running away with him sometimes, packing a bag, taking her 3 children, and leaving before it got worse. But she never did. She told herself Larry was still a good man, that he would come around. That time would soften his edges. She was wrong. The night Ezekiel disappeared, everything would change, and Vivian would never forgive herself. The heat of a Mississippi summer night clung to the house, thick and suffocating. The cicadas screamed outside, their endless buzzing filling the air. Inside, the Jenkins home was just as tense. Ezekiel had barely spoken at dinner. He barely touched his food, pushing his fork through the mashed potatoes in slow, deliberate circles. Something was off. Vivian noticed. She always noticed. Her son had been growing distant these past few months, coming home later, locking his bedroom door, barely making eye contact. She had asked him, softly, gently, but he never gave her a real answer. "It's nothing, Mama. I'm just tired." But she knew it wasn't nothing. She saw the fear in his eyes when Larry walked into the room. She saw the way he shrank into himself whenever his father spoke. He had been watching Ezekiel more, studying him, like a man piecing together a puzzle he didn't like a man realizing something he couldn't accept. And tonight would be the breaking point. It started with a sound, a crash, glass shattering. Vivian bolted upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't hesitate. She ran. She flew down the hallway, feet barely touching the ground, nearly colliding with Lorraine, who had woken up too. Then she heard it. Larry's voice, loud, furious, terrifying. "You're gonna stand here and tell me you're gay?" Vivian's stomach dropped. She reached the bottom of the stairs just in time to see it. Larry had Ezekiel pinned against the wall. One hand gripped the front of his son's shirt, his knuckles white. His chest was heaving, his face twisted with an anger so deep it didn't look human. Ezekiel, shaking, tried to push him away. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. Vivian's world blurred. "Larry, let him go!" she screamed, rushing forward. Larry didn't even glance at her. "You think I'm stupid, boy?" He spat in Ezekiel's face. "You think I don't see how you act? How you talk? I ain't raising no son of mine to be soft." Ezekiel's eyes were red, terrified, but steady. "Dad, I didn't want to lie anymore." Vivian gasped. "Number, please, baby. Not now. Not to him." Larry's rage exploded. "This is because of you." He spun toward Vivian, pointing a shaking finger at her. His face was red, veins bulging at his temples. "You raised him weak, Vivian. You coddled him. You let him turn into—" Vivian stepped in front of her son. "He's not weak, Larry. He's just what?" Larry bellowed. His fist slammed into the wall next to Ezekiel's head. The sound cracked through the house like gunfire. Lorraine was crying. Jasmine standing behind her, silent with fear. Vivian turned to her son. Baby, go to your room. But Ezekiel, he didn't move. He looked at his father, looked him dead in the eyes. I don't care what you think, he whispered. I won't be ashamed of who I am. And that was it. The moment everything shattered. Larry lunged at him. Vivian screamed. Ezekiel ran. He didn't stop to grab his shoes, didn't take anything with him. He just ran. The front door slammed open as he tore across the lawn, his breath ragged, his heart pounding so fast it made him lightheaded. Vivian rushed after him, barefoot on the pavement. Ezekiel, wait! But he was already gone, disappearing into the darkness. Vivian turned to Larry, sobbing. Go after him, she begged. Larry, please. He just stood there, and he didn't move, didn't chase his son, didn't call his name. Vivian's breath hitched. She saw it clear as day. He wasn't going after Ezekiel, because he didn't want him to come back. And in that moment, Vivian knew she had lost them both. She stayed awake the whole night, sitting by the window, watching, waiting, praying. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road. She checked the door every 5 minutes, checked the phone, checked the clock. Her baby boy, her only son, was out there, alone. She could still hear Larry's voice ringing in her ears. She could still see the way Ezekiel looked at him, the pain, the finality. Lorraine and Jasmine sat with her for hours, holding her, silent. Larry went to bed, without a word, and by the time the sun rose, Ezekiel was still gone, never seen again. The next morning, Vivian called the police. She filed the missing persons report, gave them his description. She told them he wasn't a runaway. She told them he was in danger. But they didn't listen. The officers exchanged looks. One of them sighed, rubbing his jaw. Ma'am, he's 14, right? Yes. And you said there was an argument before he left? Vivian nodded slowly. The officer jotted something down in his notepad. Then, he met her eyes and said something that made her blood run cold. Well, look, Mrs. Jenkins, he's at that age. Probably just needed to blow off some steam. And, the officer shifted awkwardly. Given what you told us about him being different, if he did run off, well, sometimes kids like that, they go find their own kind, you know. Vivian's breath caught. Kids like that. She saw it then. The police weren't going to look for him. To them, Ezekiel was already gone. And somewhere behind her, Larry stood in the doorway, silent, watching, waiting. Vivian didn't know it yet, but her husband already knew the truth. Ezekiel wasn't coming home. The missing person flyers were plastered all over Jackson. Have you seen Ezekiel Jenkins? A black and white photo of a smiling 14-year-old boy stared back from every telephone pole, church bulletin board, and grocery store window. Missing since June 1990. The entire community came together to search. Neighbors, church members, even strangers. And leading the charge was Lawrence Jenkins. Larry stood at the front of every search party, barking orders, giving interviews to the local news, shaking the hands of detectives. He stood side by side with police officers, walking through wooded areas, peering into abandoned buildings. He held Vivian's trembling body when she cried in front of reporters, whispering, "We're gonna find our boy, baby. We're gonna bring him home." He led prayers at Grace Baptist Church, standing at the pulpit, voice breaking as he begged the congregation to pray for Ezekiel's safe return. But behind closed doors, Larry Jenkins was a different man. At home, his performance stopped. He never said Ezekiel's name if he didn't have to. When people from the neighborhood asked if there were any updates, he sighed and shook his head. You know how those boys are. The words rolled off his tongue like a final verdict. He probably found his own kind and left, he would say. And the worst part? People believed him because it was 1990, because Ezekiel was black, because Ezekiel was gay. And to many people in their community, that was enough of an explanation. The police bought the story too. The missing person flyers stayed up for a few months. The search efforts got smaller. And then, they stopped. To them, the case was closed before it even began. The assumption was made. Ezekiel left on his own. Case cold. Life moved on. For everyone, except Vivian. Vivian never stopped searching, even when the flyers faded and peeled off the telephone poles, even when people stopped asking, stopped caring, even when Larry told her to let it go. And for 33 years, Vivian Jenkins waited for a son who was never coming back, for a truth that was buried right beneath her feet. The earth had kept its secret for over 3 decades, until now. It was late October 2023, a cool morning in Jackson, Mississippi, when a construction crew began clearing land on the outskirts of town. The lot had been abandoned for years, overgrown with weeds and tangled tree roots. But now, plans were in place for a new housing development. Workers operated heavy machinery, turning the soil, cutting into the past, without knowing they were about to unearth a nightmare. Then, one of them saw it. A fragment pale against the dark earth. A bone. At first, the crew thought it belonged to an animal, but as the dirt was carefully pushed aside, more fragments surfaced. A femur, a rib, the curve of a skull. Human remains. The site shut down immediately. Jackson PD arrived within the hour, followed by forensic specialists. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the property, and officers stood guard as investigators combed through the area. Word spread fast. Bones had been found. But whose? The bones were taken to the Mississippi Forensic Laboratory, where specialists worked to piece together a body that had long since turned to dust. No clothing remained, no jewelry, no evidence of how this person had died. But there was one thing that could still speak: the DNA. Technicians worked carefully, extracting genetic material from the largest bone they had, the femur. The process took weeks. They ran the profile through missing persons databases, cold case files, and then, on November 2nd, 2023, they got a match. The results came back with one name: Ezekiel Jenkins. 14 years old, last seen in 1990, vanished without a trace, now found buried in a shallow grave, barely 10 miles from his childhood home. The news spread like wildfire. After 33 years, Ezekiel hadn't run away. He had been here all along. The moment the DNA results came in, everything changed. Jackson PD had never truly investigated Ezekiel's disappearance back in 1990. They assumed he ran away, wrote him off, let the case go cold. But now they had a body, and with it, a crime. The case was immediately escalated to federal authorities. The FBI took over, knowing they weren't just looking at a missing person anymore. They were looking at murder. Agents began pulling old police reports, missing persons files, any evidence that had been collected, but there was barely anything there. Then, they looked at the people closest to Ezekiel, and that's when the trail led straight to one man: Lawrence Jenkins. As the FBI began re-examining everything, something became clear. From the moment Ezekiel disappeared, Larry controlled the story. He led the search. He convinced the police that Ezekiel ran away. He told people, "You know how those boys are." And the police believed him. But now there was no running from the truth. Ezekiel was dead, and someone put him in the ground. The FBI brought in forensic anthropologists who studied the bones carefully. There were fractures on the ribs, not from decomposition, but from force, from blows, from violence. Ezekiel hadn't just died. He had been beaten, and then he had been buried. The placement of the body, the depth of the grave, the secluded area. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. And there was only one person with the motive, the history, and the opportunity. Larry Jenkins. The investigation was strong, but one thing was missing: a direct link between Larry and the grave. Then, an old neighbor came forward, an elderly man who had lived near the Jenkins home for decades. He remembered something strange back in 1990, just a few days after Ezekiel disappeared. Larry borrowed a shovel from me. At the time, it hadn't meant anything. Larry said he needed it for yard work. But now it meant everything. Because when the FBI dug deeper, they found more. Larry's work records from 1990 showed he had the next morning off. His truck, a blue Ford F-150, had been seen driving near that wooded lot by a passing driver on the very same day Ezekiel vanished. Hours unaccounted for. Time enough to kill. Time enough to bury a body. On November 6, 2023, after 33 years, an arrest warrant was issued for Lawrence Jenkins. The charge: first-degree murder. And that morning, just as Vivian thought she was starting another normal day, there was a knock at the door. The FBI came to take away the man she had loved for 47 years. The man who had convinced her that their son had simply run away. The man who had lied to her every day since 1990. And as they placed the cuffs around his wrists, Larry didn't say a word. Because for the first time in his life, there was nothing left to say. The room was cold. Vivian sat in the middle of it all, her hands shaking in her lap. She had barely spoken since they brought her in. Her world was collapsing, and she was struggling to breathe under the weight of it. Her husband, the man she had shared 47 years with, the father of her children, the man who held her at night, who whispered prayers in church, had killed their son. And for 33 years, she had lived beside him, never knowing. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice barely there. I swear to God, I didn't know. Across from her, the lead FBI agent, Agent Warren Briggs, studied her carefully. He had seen this look before, the look of a person whose life had just shattered, the kind of grief that couldn't be faked. But grief alone wasn't enough. The law needed answers. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the file in front of him. His voice was steady, calm, firm. Mrs. Jenkins, when was the last time you saw Ezekiel? Vivian swallowed. Her throat felt raw, as if she had been screaming for hours. Maybe she had, inside her own mind. She blinked away the tears and forced herself to speak. It was that night, she whispered. The night he ran. Agent Briggs nodded. Tell me what happened. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. She saw it all again. The shouting, the glass breaking, Larry's hands gripping Ezekiel's shirt, pressing him against the wall. Her son, terrified, shaking, her begging Larry to stop. And then, Ezekiel running, bolting through the door, disappearing into the night. I wanted to go after him, she murmured, her voice breaking. I told Larry to go after him. He wouldn't. He just stood there. Agent Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he slid a folder across the table. Vivian stared at it, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. The moment she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Crime scene photos. A shallow grave. Bones, still half buried in the dirt. The fragments of a body. Her baby. Vivian's stomach twisted violently. She clapped a hand over her mouth, choking on a sob. She wanted to push the pictures away. She didn't want to see, but she couldn't look away. She had to know. Agent Briggs watched her carefully. Larry didn't just let him run, Mrs. Jenkins, he said softly. Vivian's chest tightened. What? Agent Briggs tapped the folder. He followed him. Vivian's heart stopped. No, that's not true. But then, why was Ezekiel dead? She looked up at the agent, eyes wide with horror. He told me. He said Ezekiel left. He said he ran away. Briggs nodded. That's what he wanted you to believe. Vivian's hands gripped the table. She was drowning. Her mind raced back, pulling at every memory, every moment that now felt twisted and wrong. Larry leading the search party. Larry telling the police that Ezekiel had probably run off. Larry telling her over and over, "He's gone, Viv. Let him go." A single tear slipped down her cheek. Vivian shook her head violently. Briggs's voice was even, but firm. He killed him, Mrs. Jenkins, and he buried him. Vivian clutched her chest, struggling for air. She couldn't breathe. Larry's voice rang in her head. His sermons about righteousness, his promises, his lies. She thought of the nights she spent crying herself to sleep, praying for Ezekiel to come home. And all along, Larry knew where he was. Larry put him in the ground. Vivian let out a broken, guttural sob. "God forgive me," she whispered. "God forgive me. I didn't know." But deep down, she wondered if she had always known, if somewhere, in the part of her soul she had refused to listen to, she had felt it all along. The truth, that Ezekiel never ran away. He was taken by the one man who was supposed to love him most. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Larry Jenkins sat in a metal chair, wrists shackled to the table. The gray cinderblock walls of the interrogation room pressed in around him. He had been here for hours, not speaking, not moving, just staring. The FBI agents had tried everything, threats, reasoning, even silence, but Larry refused to say a word. Until now. Agent Warren Briggs sat across from him, arms folded, waiting, watching. Larry exhaled sharply through his nose. Then, without looking up, he spoke. His voice was low, flat, emotionless. "I had to fix him." Briggs didn't react. Larry's fingers tapped against the table, slow and deliberate. "He wasn't right," he muttered. "I did what had to be done." Briggs leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Tell me what happened, Larry." For a moment, Larry didn't answer. He sat there, eyes fixed on the table, jaw tight. Then, he started talking. And what he said would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. "He looked me in the eyes," Larry murmured, "and he told me he wasn't ashamed. I don't know what came over me. I just snapped." He let out a slow breath. "He ran. Then I sneaked out to look for him in the middle of the night, when everyone was asleep in his favorite spot in the woods." Briggs listened, his face unreadable. Larry's voice was distant, like he was talking about someone else's life. "He didn't see me at first. He was just standing there, in the woods, crying." Larry's nostrils flared. He had no reason to cry. He did this to himself. Briggs didn't respond. Larry's jaw tensed. "I grabbed him, told him to come home. He said he wouldn't, that I couldn't change him." He let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "So I did the only thing I could do." Briggs felt a chill creep down his spine. "What did you do, Larry?" Larry blinked. "He fought me. I told him to stop acting like a little girl, but he kept fighting, kept talking back." His fingers tapped against the table again. "So I hit him." Briggs didn't move. Larry's voice didn't waver. "He hit the ground hard, started crying again. I told him to get up. He didn't. I didn't mean for him to die, he murmured, but he left me no choice. Lawrence Jenkins, once a respected deacon, sat motionless at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit stark against his dark skin. Shackled hands, blank stare, the face of a man who had lost everything. At one time, people looked up to him. Now, they couldn't even look at him. Vivian sat in the front row, silent, expressionless. She hadn't spoken to him since the arrest. She never would again. Grace Baptist Church, the place where Larry preached righteousness, where he led prayers, where people sought his guidance. They disowned him. His name was scrubbed from the church directory. His sermons, once recorded and played for the congregation, were deleted. And his former congregation? They sat behind Vivian, supporting her, mourning the child they had once ignored, because now everyone saw the truth. Larry Jenkins wasn't a father. He was a murderer. It didn't take the jury long, only 3 hours. When they returned, no one looked at Larry. The judge's voice rang through the silent courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. Vivian exhaled slowly. Larry didn't flinch. He didn't cry, didn't plead. He just stared ahead. Then came the sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The gavel came down. It was over. Vivian finally stood, turning toward the exit. She never looked back, because Larry Jenkins was already dead to her. And Ezekiel? Now, he could finally rest. For 33 years, Larry had convinced himself that he had won, that he had buried his shame, that no one would ever find the truth. But the past never stays buried. Not forever. One bone in the woods, one clue, and everything came crashing down. The man who once preached righteousness, fatherhood, respect, was exposed as nothing more than a monster, a man who chose his own pride over his own child. And now, his name would only be remembered as a warning. Vivian had shared a home with a killer, slept beside him, prayed with him, believed him, and yet, she never truly knew him. And that's the question that lingers. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What secrets sit behind the smiles? What truths are waiting to be uncovered? What happens when the person you trust most isn't who you think they are? This was the story of a father's crime, a mother's grief, and a truth buried for decades. But stories like this happen more often than we think. People live double lives. Families hold dark secrets. And sometimes the truth is right in front of us.